There's not supposed to be one clear best Pokemon team. The very concept of such a thing seems impossible. By the time Sword and Shield were wrapping up, there were over 900 Pokemon released, and today there's over 1,000. With so many Pokemon to choose from, it seems impossible that any combination of 6 would be so much better than all the rest. But that's exactly what happened in the final year of Pokemon Sword and Shield. A team was built that, against all odds, appeared to be better than anything else that players could come up with. A team that I myself tried and failed to counter. A team that took the world by storm. This team didn't invoke the same sense of fear as the Big Six team that was the most dominant team in history, nor did it leave the same legacy as the Chalk team that is still used to prove Pokemon players lack creativity. But for those of us who faced it, it absolutely left its mark and earned the title of the strongest team in all of Pokemon Sword and Shield. This is the story of Rinya Sun. And like many of the best teams in history, it all started with one player. You can probably guess that Rinya Sun was a Sun team. That leaves us with the Rinya part, named after Rinya Kobayashi, the architect and namesake of this game-changing team.
Yeah, you might not actually know this, but Rinya refers to the creator, not the team. Yeah, it's a common misconception.
And just like Frankenstein, this creation was nothing short of monstrous. Before this team, Rinya Kobayashi was known to be a strong competitor, but not everyone knew what he was capable of. And they certainly had no idea that his team would change the entire VGC landscape and catapult his name to household status. Rinya first piloted the team in February in a global challenge, an online tournament. After he finished 6th, his squad caught the eye of a few enterprising players, and from there, the team spread like Gmax wildfire. That's foreshadowing. Ooh. Now, maybe you think I'm being hyperbolic, that I'm exaggerating for dramatic effect. Maybe you're thinking that the team had some use, but didn't really take over. Well, as a counterpoint, what if I told you that Rinya Sun won 3 regional level events in a row? That's right. From mid-March to April 2022, Rinya's team won 3 events over 4 weekends. Salt Lake City Regionals, Liverpool Regionals, and the Taichung Special Event, which is basically a regional except you don't get any prize money if you win. Now though, people had been warned. You couldn't so much as look at a Zacian without being reminded that if you wanted to win any tournament, you'd have to make it past a whole lot of Rinya Sun. Not that the Rinya Sun players seemed to mind, because later that very April, at the largest event since tournaments came back after lockdown, Rinya Sun won the European International Championships, making it clear that this team was going down in history. Now, it is worth noting that none of the players who won these events were Rinya himself. Rinya was a strong competitor in his own right, but unable to travel outside of Japan until later in the year at Worlds. We'll get there. That didn't matter. The community knew who was responsible for the monstrous team appearing in their dreams, and Rinya's name was the one on everyone's lips. You would rarely find one word without the other, because Rinya Sun was very, very different from traditional Sun. This was a firestorm like no other, a new perspective on a team archetype that had been around for over a decade. So let's break down just what made this team so unbelievably powerful. In order to understand any team, we have to understand the context in which it's used, the rule set that it was built for, meaning the other Pokemon that are legal in the format. Rinya Sun was built for a rule set called Series 12, which allowed for players to use not 1, but 2 normally banned legendary Pokemon called restricted Pokemon. Let's start by talking about them, since they're supposed to be the biggest hitters on any team. They're supposed to be, but that doesn't tell the whole story here. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin by talking about one of the most iconic restricted Pokemon of all time. Any team with Sun in the name has to start with a drought, and it should come as no surprise that this specific team uses the originator of the ability, Groudon. Most of the time that it's been legal, Groudon has been considered one of the strongest Pokemon around. It's not hard to see why. It's got a bonkers ability, best-in-class stats, a powerful and risky signature move called Precipitous Blades, and most importantly, an upgraded form called Primal Groudon, which takes it from good to completely overpowered. Primal Groudon is so strong that it was in contention for the strongest Pokemon in the game every single time that it was legal. However, Sword and Shield stripped Groudon of its fancy power-up, and that changes the Pokemon entirely, because wherever there's Groudon, you're sure to find its greatest enemy, Kyogre. And without Primal Reversion to keep it safe, Groudon was suddenly a lot more vulnerable to the whale. Kyogre's natural type advantage means that it's able to hit Groudon super effectively while not having to worry about the reverse. In other words, this rivalry is pretty lopsided. Even with the sun cutting the damage from water moves in half, Kyogre still does so much damage. Even though Kyogre also lost its primal form, it gained something in exchange. See, in Sword and Shield, there was a new best restricted Pokemon in town named Zacian. We're going to talk about Zacian in depth in a second, but what you need to know for now is that this Pokemon had a litany of strengths, but only 2 weaknesses, to fire and ground. Pairing Zacian with Kyogre then was a natural idea, since Kyogre not only hit these 2 types for super effective damage, but could even weaken the fire moves without needing to attack. But okay, this team doesn't use Kyogre, it uses Groudon. We can see just how weak Groudon was without the Red Orb, because in Scarlet and Violet, he's been a mediocre restricted Pokemon at best. Like, probably about the 10th best one, and there's not that many of them, so that's not very good. However, here in Sword and Shield, it's the basis of one of the most dominant teams of all time, and it still lacks Primal Reversion. So what's the difference? When I was telling you all the ways that Groudon had it hard earlier, I buried the gigantic lead a bit. See, it is true that Kyogre was a natural fit to pair with Zacian, but it's also true that Groudon gains something in Sword and Shield as well: Dynamax. This once per battle mechanic lets you double a Pokemon's HP, receive a power boost on most of your moves, and gives you access to a bunch of useful secondary effects, all while allowing you to do damage through Protect and making you immune to flinching. Kyogre was also a strong candidate to Dynamax, but Groudon used this mechanic incredibly well. Not only did it help it do its job of sitting on the field and attacking, it also let it buff itself, whether it was via the special defense boost of Max Quake, or more importantly, the Sun from Max Flare, which let Groudon reset the Sun if Kyogre tried to take it away, all without needing to switch out. About that special defense boost, it applied not only to Groudon, but also to its partner Pokemon, and you could use it every single turn until Dynamax ended, after 3 turns, or until Groudon was knocked out or switched out. Because the effect worked as long as you did damage, and because Max moves did a quarter of their damage through Protect, it was very difficult to stop Groudon from boosting up. And if you're thinking that Groudon with doubled HP and increased special defense sounds hard to break through, well, maybe we should talk about Groudon's item. Now, nothing is quite as well made for Groudon as the Red Orb, but if there is another item that comes close, it's gotta be Assault Vest. Groudon is a Pokemon with humongous HP and physical defense who lacks a bit on the special side, and wants to spend most of its time attacking, making it as close to an ideal user of the Assault Vest, which increases your special bulk by a massive 50%, but prevents you from using non-damaging moves, as you'll ever see. By the way, the special defense boost from Assault Vest and Max Quake are multiplicative, not additive. So the 50% boost from the item and the 50% boost from one special defense raise combines for 125% rather than 100%. Of course, the downside of Assault Vest is very real. Groudon would be unable to use non-damaging moves, most notably Protect. Normally, this makes using Assault Vest Pokemon risky due to the prevalence of the move Fake Out, since it stops a Pokemon from moving but only works the first turn after a Pokemon hits the field. It's a move you really want Protect to stop from messing with you. Of course, since Dynamax Pokemon cannot be flinched, the Assault Vest in turn lost one of its main drawbacks. So, with its new nifty red item, Groudon struck an absurd balance between damage and tankiness, ensuring it stayed in the field long enough to throw out multiple Precipice Blades, Max Quakes, or Max Flares, whatever the situation called for. Dynamax and the Assault Vest also significantly improved the Kyogre matchup. Picture this: you lead Groudon and you know your opponent has Kyogre in the back, but as they try to switch in, you Max Quake, doing tons of damage and giving yourself a special defense boost, enough to live the incoming attack. Or maybe you just Max Flare yourself, resetting the weather on the same turn that it changed. Rinya used Heat Crash as his fire move of choice. His last 2 moves were Stone Edge and Heavy Slam. Stone Edge was mostly here as a coverage move for the various flying types of the format, but Heavy Slam's Max Steel Spike also boosted his team's defense in addition to handling opposing fairy types. A quick note for this initial section, by the way, I'm just going to focus on the original team that Rinya brought in terms of moves and items. We'll save the spin-offs for once we're done with the pilot. Kyogre in the rain could still cause some issues, so Rinya did have his other ways to deal with Kyogre, which we'll get to later. But he started the team off with a measure that ensured that even when the weather wasn't in his favor, he could still compete. Groudon was hard to remove while dealing consistent damage, whether in or out of Dynamax. And that's a good thing because the next Pokemon on this team couldn't Dynamax. Rinya's second Pokemon was the very restricted Pokemon his Groudon was intended to beat, Zacian. Zacian was the single best restricted Pokemon in Sword and Shield. At the World Championships that year, it was the second most used Pokemon in the tournament, despite taking one of the 2 restricted slots on a team. It was used on over 2/3 of teams, and only Incineroar had more usage. And Incineroar had more usage in part because of its good matchup into Zacian. But what made Zacian the agreed upon best restricted Pokemon in the format? And how is it possible it was used so much without even being able to Dynamax? Well, Zacian had a lot going for it. The single best typing in the game certainly didn't hurt, with Steel and Fairy providing ridiculous resistances and good offenses. The typing's only weakness was its inability to hit Fire and Steel type Pokemon, a weakness compensated for in its move pool, with access to the fighting move Sacred Sword that not only hit Steel Pokemon for super effective damage, but also hit the primary fire type Incineroar for big damage as well. And if Zacian was doing super effective damage, you needed to be worried. As if 170 base attack weren't enough, that's just 10 behind Primal Groudon, by the way, Zacian also received a +1 attack boost every time it switched in, which is a 50% attack increase. Even neutral hits from this thing would just delete Pokemon. And maybe you're thinking about how Dynamax doubled a Pokemon's HP, which could let them survive a hit from Zacian. But think again. Zacian's signature move, Behemoth Blade, dealt double damage to all Dynamax Pokemon, effectively ignoring the doubled HP effect. Oh yeah, by the way, if you're thinking maybe the best way to slow Zacian down is to knock it out before it can move, good luck with that. With the 3rd highest speed in the format, only 2 other Pokemon were capable of outspeeding it, and they were both frail and hard to protect. Plus, they both had a pretty bad matchup into Groudon. If you started playing with Scarlet and Violet, and you're wondering why you've never seen Zacian this generation, that's because they nerfed it into the ground after what it did in Sword and Shield. Zacian could neutralize opposing Dynamax Pokemon, draw threats, tank hits, and most importantly, win games. It was the finisher, whether for Rinya or any other player who might be using it, which again was pretty much everyone. It only had one weakness, its inability, or maybe its refusal, to Dynamax. Luckily, it usually didn't need to, because the 3rd member of the team was the strongest Dynamax attacker ever made, a 1 Pokemon weapon of incomparable force, Game Freak's favorite baby boy. Gigantamax Charizard was the single most broken Dynamax attacker ever made. Period. Full stop. I knew from the very beginning that the balancing team had been on vacation when this thing was released, and I built a team for the very first event of Sword and Shield with my friends Dr. Aaron Trailer and Justin Karras, all built around this Charizard. Aaron won that event, and that was before Charizard was able to reach its full sun-boosted potential. Charizard's totally unrivaled damage comes down to 2 things: its signature Gigantamax move, Gmax Wildfire, as well as its ability, Solar Power. Gmax Wildfire, oh god, where do I begin? Okay, picture this. You use a move that does only 1 point of damage, just 1 measly point. However, for the next 4 turns, at the end of every turn, both of your opponent's Pokemon lose a 1/6 of their HP unless they are Fire type. A 1/6 might not sound like a lot, but it's a 1/6 every turn, and it goes through Protect, and you're still able to attack on all future turns. If you were to take the full amount of damage from this move, it will result in 2/3 of both of your opponent's Pokemon's health. As a passive effect, that's a 1/3 of their total HP for the battle. And if you switch out, the effect stays, by the way, you can't just get rid of it. Since this is flat damage, you also can't use bulky Pokemon like Blissey to tank the hit. Well, that sounds pretty strong, right? Well, that's what Gmax Wildfire did, with one little change. Instead of doing only 1 point of damage, it could one-shot almost any Pokemon that didn't resist fire, as well as some that could. Gmax Wildfire KOs Assault Vest Groudon in 1 hit. Why? The secret is in the multiplicative scaling of Dynamax, or in this case Gigantamax. They're the same thing, it's just Charizard gets a special move that other fire types don't get. Because Dynamax got rid of the secondary effects of moves, you could afford to run higher power, higher risk moves without the drawback. In this case, Charizard would mostly use the super powered Blast Burn, with 150 base power. But that 150 would be multiplied by 50% when the sun was active, and then by another 30% from Charizard's Life Orb held item, and then by another 50% from Charizard's ability. Solar Power, and then by another 50% because Charizard is a fire type, giving its fire moves a damage bonus. When factoring in these multipliers, our 150 base power move ends up with over 650 power. That's almost 4 times. Wait, no, that's over 4 times. That's over 4 times, Jesus. Of course, both Solar Power and Life Orb come with a pretty big drawback: health lost at the end of every turn. Between the 1/8 from Solar Power and the 1/10 from Life Orb, Charizard should have ended up a glass cannon, capable of doing huge damage, but not able to stick around for very long. It should have been a glass cannon, if not for the way that Dynamax works. See, the percentage HP lost is still calculated off of Charizard's original HP. And if you're not a nerd, what that means is that when you're Dynamaxed, you take half damage from these recoil effects. So instead of losing 10% from Life Orb, Charizard was only losing 5%. And turn after turn, that extra health really adds up. This Pokemon, which by the way happens to be Rinya's favorite on the team, was his functional 3rd restricted Pokemon. In fact, Charizard was like a super restricted. Most other restricted Pokemon couldn't even hope to live up to its ridiculous damage output. In addition to its bonkers damage, Charizard also brought something the team was sorely lacking at this point: speed control. See, Charizard didn't just have one of the most broken max moves, it had 2, with its flying typing allowing it to use Max Airstream. Max Airstream was also created when the balancing team was out for lunch. Not only is flying a good offensive type, but using Max Airstream gave both of your Pokemon a speed boost. Speed is arguably the most important stat in the game, and allowed Charizard to snowball out of control by taking its medium fast starting speed and ending up at the extra fast range. Max Airstream had the best benefit out of any of the regular non-Gigantamax max moves. The regular Dynamax moves is what I'm trying to say. And by the way, the other offensive max moves in Max Knuckle and Max Ooze received a pretty major power decrease when Dynamaxed when compared to the other types. They clearly recognize that giving you an offensive stat boost when you're already attacking is pretty powerful and would allow people to just run away with the game. But the speed boosting max move did not receive this treatment, and the reason is just simply beyond me. I told you earlier that Charizard used the Life Orb to spike its damage even more, but that wasn't the case for Rinya's Charizard. Because it was able to do so much damage with the passive benefit from Gmax Wildfire, many players, including Rinya, opted to use defensive items on Charizard to ensure that it could stick around and cause chaos. Many Charizard teams ran the Charty Berry item to handle its glaring rock weakness, but Rinya instead opted for the Lumberry to handle opposing Grimmsnarl's Thunder Waves. That may seem a little specific to you, but keep in mind 2 things. First, back in Sword and Shield, we were playing with closed team sheets, so this sort of surprise tech was pretty feasible. Not to mention that Grimmsnarl was one of the best supporting Pokemon in the game, and they normally ran Thunder Wave. And if you add in the fact that Rinya initially made this team for the best of 1 global challenge, aka the place where standard teams go to die, it starts to make a little bit more sense why he wanted a little bit of gimmick insurance. Charizard had pretty ridiculous built-in synergy with Groudon thanks to the sun, but the two worked well together past the obvious reasons. See, while Groudon was a very good Dynamax Pokemon in its own right, it was also perfectly functional without Dynamax. In fact, it only had access to spread damage when it didn't Dynamax, since all max moves become single target. So if you wanted to hit both Pokemon, you needed Groudon to remain small mode. It's also true that Charizard could still do big damage outside of Dynamax, although it was a bit less reliable thanks to its much lower bulk. But the important thing is that either Pokemon could Dynamax or stay regular form, and they would still be useful, opening up a huge range of options just from the word go. This trio formed Rinya's offensive core, as they did for many other Sun teams in the format. At this point, it's a nice start with some cool ideas, like Assault Vest Groudon and Lumberry Charizard. However, most Sun teams didn't see the same success, despite many of them using similar Pokemon. And that's because, traditionally, Sun teams rely on offense, using explosive, complementary damage to clear the path for Charizard, Zacian, and Groudon. Rinya, however, had a different path in mind, and instead of trying to add more damage, he instead added an impressive defensive backbone. It all starts with the next Pokemon. I already mentioned how rough the Kyogre matchup was. Rinya had some purchase thanks to his Assault Vest, but he still needed more. Other teams might accomplish this by using one of the chlorophyll boosted grass type Pokemon that you so often see paired on Sun teams. Most often Venusaur, although recently there's been some other ones like Jumpluff as well. But the thing is that Venusaur still wanted the sun to be up, and Kyogre frequently ran Max Hailstorm and flying type partner Pokemon, which could both threaten Venusaur and shut off the weather. So Rinya had a different idea. He would beat Kyogre harder than any grass type ever could, using an unassuming Pokemon that spelled disaster for the legendary whale.
I fear no man. But that thing, it scares me.
One shudders to imagine what inhuman thoughts lie behind that.
Gastrodon has sparked the most hotly contested debate in competitive Pokemon history. Luminaries of the game have gone back and forth without consensus, inspiring fierce arguments on either side. The question, blue or pink Gastrodon? The answer, of course, is blue. And if you agree with me, you should subscribe. You should also subscribe if you want more competitive Pokemon history videos, because guess what? You can't get them anywhere else right now. This is it, baby. Subscribe. To be serious, Gastrodon's competitive worth has been a subject of scrutiny for years at this point. Some people call it underrated, others call it the fakest good Pokemon of all time, and then it ended up winning the World Championships twice. So the debate hasn't been present for a little bit. I will admit that there were formats where I thought that Gastrodon was overrated, but that could not be said about the Gastrodon on Rinya's team. To be clear, Gastrodon in general was much better in Sword and Shield thanks to the move Yawn. Yawn had always been situationally good, but it turned to great when it could be used as a Dynamax deterrent. The theory is that Yawn causes a Pokemon to fall asleep unless it switches out. But if you switched out your Dynamax Pokemon, you would lose your Dynamax for the rest of the battle. Hitting a maxed Mon with Yawn forced them to make a difficult choice: fall asleep or give up their Dynamax. Of course, Yawn was not the main reason that Gastrodon suited Rinya's team. That would be its ability, Storm Drain. Storm Drain not only makes Gastrodon immune to all water moves, it also redirects them away from its partner and gives Gastrodon a special attack boost in the process. Gastrodon's ability has always made it a fairly good answer to Kyogre. It's immune to water moves, as well as Kyogre's most frequent coverage option in Thunder, and with Hidden Power removed in Generation 8, Kyogre's best option to hit Gastrodon was usually an Ice move, which only did neutral damage and Gastrodon didn't really care about. But in a theme you might see emerging in this team, Gastrodon is specifically a great counter to Dynamax Kyogre. Kyogre's most appealing attribute has always been its rain-boosted spread moves, whether that's Origin Pulse or Water Spout. When a spread move is used versus Storm Drain, Gastrodon still takes no damage and gets the special attack boost, but its partner will still take the full power of the attack. The same is not true, however, for Max Geyser. Remember, max moves all become single target. And while that means you can get around Wide Guard, it also means that if you have Dynamax Kyogre, you can no longer just ignore Gastrodon and blow up its partner Pokemon. If the big fish gets bigger and Gastrodon is lurking in the back, it's pretty much a waste of the mechanic, to the point where that would likely lose you the match on the spot. Gastrodon's very presence drastically limits Kyogre's options. Actually, no, it's more than that. Just the possibility that Gastrodon is lurking is enough to send Kyogre into a tizzy. Sure, Kyogre could still threaten Groudon by not Dynamaxing, but without the doubled HP, it becomes much harder to keep it alive, especially in front of Zacian or a Max Quake from Groudon. Not to mention, without Dynamaxing, Kyogre needs to switch out and in again to reset the rain, rather than using Max Geyser's secondary effect. Gastrodon's utility mostly came from staying alive as long as possible, and its set was built around that concept. We already mentioned Yawn, and while you might expect Recover, Rinya instead ran two attacking moves: Earth Power and Ice Beam. Earth Power was Gastrodon's best ground-type move, and was able to do good damage to some of the most common threats like Zacian and Incineroar. Despite Gastrodon not being the most offensive Pokemon, this could still do good damage. Ice Beam hit opposing flying, grass, and ground types, such as Landorus Therian, Thundurus Incarnate, and even enemy Groudon. Rinya found his sustain elsewhere, in the item slot. Leftovers like Gastrodon stick around as long as possible, thwarting Kyogre's attempts to muscle through with Hailstorm and supporting Fire. By Rinya's own admission, Gastrodon's best strategy was to, and I quote, sit in front of an opponent with low attack power, recover with leftovers, and repeatedly use Yawn. End quote. It's a simple game plan, but it's also a devastating one. The rest of the team put out so much damage that Gastrodon didn't need to do much other than force the opponent to slow down. While the opponent was busy protecting and switching out a Yawn, the wildfire damage would quickly rack up, or Groudon would spiral out of control with its stat boosts. Oh yeah, if you thought that getting rid of leftovers Gastrodon was annoying before, imagine trying to do it when Groudon has given it 3 special defense boosts. Here, we start to see just how this team sets itself apart from the Sun teams of old. Sun is traditionally seen as an explosive, offensive archetype that leverages literal firepower and volatile weapons like chlorophyll-boosted sleep powder. And sure, it's true that this team had a lot of offense, but it could also achieve its victories over time, leveraging bulk and residual damage to play a meticulous, long-term game plan. And if there's any Pokemon that drives that concept home, it's our next one. Rinya referred to this Pokemon as the command center of his team, and it's not hard to see why. Grimmsnarl is a Swiss Army knife Pokemon for any situation. Need some extra physical bulk for your Groudon? Click Reflect. Want to try and hamper the opponent with status and slow them down in the process? Try Thunder Wave. Do you want to do some damage and you can do even more to stronger opponents? Foul Play. These moves are all somewhat standard on Grimmsnarl, but the same could not be said for the final move, Trick, and the item of choice, Iron Ball. Iron Ball does two things when it's held by a Pokemon. First, it cuts the speed of the Pokemon holding it in half. And second, it causes any Pokemon not currently on the ground to land, causing them to take damage from ground type attacks. Of course, Grimmsnarl is already grounded, so the grounding effect isn't relevant here. And thanks to its prankster ability, it also didn't really interact with the speed stat in the way that most other Pokemon have to. In other words, the downsides of Iron Ball didn't really affect Grimmsnarl. The same cannot be said of its targets. Trick switches the held item of the user and the target, so Grimmsnarl could steal the items of its foes and stick them with a very heavy, useless ball in exchange. Like the worst white elephant of all time. Iron Ball could, of course, be used as a one-time speed control solution that was more reliable than Thunder Wave because it never missed. But that was only the start of its uses. Trick in itself was a big obstacle for plenty of item-based Pokemon. Calyrex Shadows suddenly found themselves slower than expected when they had their Choice Scarf nabbed, or vulnerable to a one-shot after losing their Focus Sash. Calyrex Ices with weakness policies would be left feeling very weak indeed after their Mimikyu's Shadow Sneak just amounted to a little chip damage. But the real trick was when Grimmsnarl would switch items with a flying type, or a Pokemon with Levitate, but in this format it was mostly flying types. Imagine your opponent has Charizard, and they want to Gmax Wildfire your Groudon. With Trick, you can not only allow your Groudon to attack first, but you can also make the flying type Charizard suddenly weak to ground moves, deleting it in a single attack. A Charizard with Charti Berry that felt safe wouldn't be able to rely on the item, and wouldn't even go down to a rock move like they were probably expecting. Grimmsnarl was the big question mark that allowed this team to play in so many different ways. It could simultaneously facilitate its teammates' offenses and set up for huge KOs, or help them stick around, slowing down matches just like Gastrodon. I know I already said it, but I cannot emphasize enough just how effective Groudon and Charizard were with multiple turns to attack. Even guaranteeing that your Charizard could just get its first Wildfire off put the opponent on a timer, softening things up for Zacian. Anything after that was often extra credit. That damage mitigation was especially important because of one other aspect of this team, or I should say one aspect that this team was missing, a crucial piece of most VGC teams. This team, the best team of the generation, is missing something? What could it be? The answer is speed control. Sure, Grimmsnarl has Thunder Wave and Iron Ball, and Charizard has Max Airstream, but the team is sorely lacking in any sort of field effect like Tailwind or Trick Room. You haven't seen the last Pokemon yet, but spoilers, nothing to be found there either. When your opponent is always attacking you first, you better make sure that you can actually take those hits and fire back even harder. This is a team with a unique archetype. Instead of explicit speed control, it's damage mitigation that makes it tick. One of the skills needed in Dynamax formats was the ability to bait out your opponent's Dynamax while preserving your own. And of all the Pokemon on this team, Grimmsnarl was arguably the best at enabling this. Imagine a Grimmsnarl and Charizard lead. You're threatening a huge Gmax Wildfire. In response, your opponent Dynamaxes, only to watch as Charizard switches out into a bulky Pokemon, and Grimmsnarl sets up Reflect. Maybe Gastrodon comes in and shrugs off your hit, all while your Dynamax turns slip away from you. Or maybe it's another Pokemon lurking in the back that you dread to see no matter how much you know it's coming. A Pokemon many of us are familiar with, the greatest Pokemon ever made.
Down! That didn't take much! The champion has been decided!
That's right, it's Incineroar. You know what he does, but he does it better here than ever before. We've already established that Rinya's team can function well via all-out offense or by stalling the opponent's Dynamax out. Incineroar helps enable both sides. Fake Out might not work against Dynamax Pokemon, but what about after you've stalled it out? Dynamax only lasts for 3 turns, and once that's over, there's nowhere to hide from the cat. Keep in mind that things like Covert Cloak and Terra Ghost as well as Clear Amulet didn't exist yet, meaning that Dynamax was kinda your only protection from the cat. If you preserved your Dynamax for after your opponent's ended, you could do some really evil things by pairing Fake Out with a max move that hits through Protect. Of course, Incineroar also enabled defensive play, with its suite of utilities slowing things down. Incineroar was also good for some Sword and Shield specific battle tactics. It was a commonly accepted maxim that, in general, the player who Dynamaxed second would have an advantage. Incineroar came jam-packed with ways to delay your own Dynamax, getting that all-important edge. This was especially potent next to something like Groudon, who actually enjoyed firing off a non-Dynamaxed Precipice Blades or two before it had to hit the big button. Move-wise, Incineroar ran Fake Out, Parting Shot, Flare Blitz, and Burning Jealousy. The first two let Rinya maintain ever-important board control, while Flare Blitz actually did good damage when boosted by the sun. Burning Jealousy is a move that most of you probably don't know about if you didn't play during Sword and Shield, since it was really only good against Zacian and Dynamaxed Pokemon. It's a relatively weak fire-type special attack, but you don't use it for its damage. It hits both of your opponent's Pokemon, and burns anything that got a stat boost during this turn. Remember, back in Sword and Shield, Zacian got an attack boost every single time it switched in, and with Burning Jealousy hitting both of your opponent's Pokemon, that meant you could guaranteed burn Zacian if it came in when you clicked the move. This attack had some other uses as well, like Breaking Focus Sash and Caloric Shadow and Shadow Shield on Lunala, and could also be used to punish Pokemon boosting their stats with max moves like opposing Groudon. Item-wise, Rinya opted for the popular Figgy Berry to keep Incineroar around, and that is really all I have to say about this Pokemon. And I'm sure also all that you want to hear. Those are the 6 Pokemon, but just knowing them doesn't do this team justice. I've already talked about how you could play this team slow or fast, but in reality, that's just scratching the surface. Really, you could play this team every single way under its bright, burning sun, and that was its true strength. For a Sun team, Rinya Sun was remarkably flexible. Actually, it was just flexible for a team in general. Just the leads alone were totally malleable thanks to the power of Grimmsnarl and Incineroar. With their damage mitigation and the natural bulk of so many of the Pokemon on the team, like Groudon and Zacian and Gastrodon, nearly any single Pokemon could be in the back to switch in. A simple glance at Rinya's recommended matchup guide will show you a constantly shifting mix of Pokemon. Here's a basic example which should hopefully help you understand just how dangerous this team was to fight against. You lead Groudon and Charizard, threatening the highest potential damage on the team. First, your opponent has to figure out which Pokemon you're Dynamaxing, if you're even Dynamaxing at all. That's a big question, and if you're wrong, you'll be in trouble. But even if you know which Pokemon is Dynamaxing, you have to figure out what move it's going for. Is Charizard going to raise its speed or go for Gmax Wildfire? And is there spread damage coming from the other Pokemon? Let's say you're afraid of Charizard Gigantamaxing and blowing up your whole team in one move. So maybe you Dynamax one Pokemon and you switch in Incineroar for the other one, only to have them switch in their own Incineroar and Gastrodon, now threatening an unstoppable Fake Out and yawn into your Dynamax Pokemon. You could always try and predict this defensive play, but if you don't respect Charizard and you eat a Max Airstream or a Gmax Wildfire, the game may end a bit before you'd like it to, and not necessarily in your favor. Ignoring Groudon and letting it get a Max Quake Up while you play defensive could also have disastrous consequences. Every Pokemon on this team had a bevy of options available. Even the most offensive threats could switch out and make use of the team's bulk, screens, parting shot, burns, thunder waves, yawns, whatever. What's more, almost every single Pokemon specifically interacted with Dynamax in some way. Groudon and Charizard used the mechanic themselves, but the other Pokemon could all punish opposing Dynamax. Zacian did double damage, Gastrodon had Yawn, Incineroar could exploit the transformation with Burning Jealousy while slowing them down with Intimidate and Parting Shot. And then there's Grimmsnarl. Thunder Waving or tricking a Dynamax Pokemon often set them up to be KO'd by Charizard, Zacian, or Groudon, and often before they could finish their Dynamax turns. And if Thunder Wave was on the table, that also gave a chance for every future max move to fail. This flexibility afforded the team two very important strengths. First, it could adapt to nearly any matchup. Second, it could adapt to nearly any player. Offensive, high volatility players could go pedal to the metal with Charizard and Zacian. More defensive players could use the pivoting and utility power of Grimmsnarl and Incineroar. And that's not even accounting for the changes that people made. Because up until this point, we've only been talking about Rinya's original team. But like I told you, Rinya was far from the only player to use it. And because the core of this team was so strong, players were free to put their own spins on it, something all the more effective in the era of closed team sheets. As an example, we can look at the first variation to win a regional level event after the team's inception. The first gold medal came in Salt Lake City. Credit to Chongjun Peng. Chongjun ran with a few concerted changes that made the team more consistent for best of 3 replay. He switched Grimmsnarl to Light Clay and gave it Light Screen in addition to Reflect, dropping the Trick Tech. He changed Incineroar from Burning Jealousy to Darkest Lariat. And he also gave Groudon Fire Punch over Heat Crash, which gave it more consistent overall damage at the cost of damage on Rillaboom and Amoonguss. Speaking of Groudon, Chongjun made a few other changes that improved his matchup into opposing Groudon and friends. Incineroar was given a Shuka Berry instead of Figgy, which reduced the damage of super effective ground moves in half one time. This greatly improved its ability to switch into opposing Groudon, even if it meant taking a max Quake. Second, he gave Charizard Chardy Berry and Ancient Power, dropping a second fire move, which simultaneously improved its ability to hit opposing Charizard with rock moves and gave it a way to survive any random rock moves coming its way. Chongjun's version is just one example of the many changes you could make to this team. Charizard could go for Life Orb to maximize its damage, or back to Rinya's Lum. Grimmsnarl could go back to Trick, but with a new item like Lagging Tail, or of course it could also use Iron Ball. And the moves had plenty of options too. All of Zacian, Groudon, and Charizard could opt for different coverage moves depending on what you wanted to cover. The different variations made the team incredibly hard to beat, especially in the closed team sheet format that we were playing back then, and a nightmare to prepare for. You needed different plans for different versions, and you often wouldn't know what specific choices someone had made until it was too late. I say this from experience, because I tried to counter Rinya Sun myself. Now, I consider myself to be half decent at taking on the best teams of a format. Taking down the strongest team in history is what allowed me to win the Pokemon World Championships, which is another video in its own right. So I felt somewhat confident that I'd be able to do the same to Rinya Sun when I realized this was going to be the best team of the format. At European Internationals 2022, I crafted a team alongside my friends to specifically dismantle Rinya Sun, and I thought that I had succeeded. I beat the first two Rinya Sun teams that I faced, and then I played Eric Rios. Eric had a few tricks on his team. Spirit Break Grimmsnarl, Throw Chop Incineroar, but nothing I hadn't seen before. Nothing I hadn't prepared against. Except I hadn't prepared against Eric. Against somebody who was truly a master of this team. And so I lost to the team that I designed my team to beat. The issue was that the team had so many options, so many paths to victory that I just hadn't considered them all. Eric, with his experience with the team, was able to find paths that forced me to gamble while he could play relatively safe. And that's not all. My friend Marcus, who had worked on the team with me, also played Eric, and actually played against him twice. And he lost both times as well, once in Swiss and once in top 8. Our team that was supposed to counter Rinya Sun went 0-3 against Eric. Eric then went on to win the entire tournament with a team that everyone had been preparing for. This, more than anything, should show you not just how good Rinya Sun was, but how good it was in the hands of an exceptional player. Eric didn't just win because he used the best team, he won by using it to its fullest potential. Because a good player doesn't just play aggressive or defensive all the time, they make you expect one and then they switch to the other. It's a credit to Rinya Sun that it allowed those switch-ups, and a credit to Eric that he could actually use them. All of this is just with the same 6 Pokemon. We haven't even mentioned the various spin-offs. As time went by, the exact 6 broke apart a bit, though some people still used all of them. But the core partnerships only got stronger, inspiring new teams. Versions with Lunala over Zacian popped up, allowing for a Trick Room mode that addressed the lack of speed control. Some people went with the more traditional Venusaur over Gastrodon, giving them high volatility damage, status, and an additional Gigantamax user. These variations don't mean that the original Rinya Sun version was like outdated or obsolete. They're just the hallmarks of a team with such a strong spine that it can sustain new growth. And the ultimate proof of that came at the ultimate tournament, the World Championships. While Rinya Sun didn't win the tournament, a Lunala Regieleki version took 2nd, the exact 6 took 7th, and 2019 World Champion Naoto Mitsubishi took 8th, with a team that only subbed out Zacian for Lunala. All of these teams sported their own unique flavor, from full incense, scary face Sucker Punch Grimmsnarl, to versions of Groudon that ran Bulk Up and Leftovers, or White Herb and Swords Dance. Countless other Rinya spin-offs ran the gamut down the placements, but I want to talk about just one player in particular, someone outside the top 8, a man by the name of Rinya Kobayashi. That's right, after experimenting with other teams for months, and even trying a totally different archetype in his run to a top 16 finish at the Japanese National Championships, the Mad Doctor returned to his creation, with the exact same 6 Pokemon, but a slew of changes. So let's use Rinya's last ride as evidence of just how much you could shift this team, even in the hands of its creator. First off, we gotta understand why Rinya dropped the team in the first place. And that requires us going back to another team, Zacian Kyogre, also known as Swordfish if you're feeling fancy. This team combined one of the strongest Pokemon of all time, Kyogre, with the strongest Pokemon of the current day, Zacian. It was a simple concept, but that didn't mean it was any less strong. The mix of best-in-class spread damage with Zacian's immense single target power, as well as the inherent typing synergy between these two Pokemon, made for a formidable team. In fact, it was one of Rinya Sun's hardest matchups. While the original Rinya team was designed in part to beat both of these Pokemon, it was a third Pokemon that was causing problems: Defiant Life Orb Thundurus. In Rinya's team report, he describes this combo as nearly impossible to beat with the previous version of Rinya Sun. Thundurus and Incineroar together exerted too much pressure as a lead, thanks to their ability to threaten both Groudon and Charizard. And if Kyogre and Thundurus got in the right position, things were basically over on the spot. The main problem was this. Usually, Rinya would mitigate damage from Kyogre teams by using Sun, Intimidate, and Grimmsnarl. But Thundurus was immune to Thunder Wave, unbothered by Sun, and boosted by Intimidate, allowing it to run rampant over both Groudon and Charizard. It is true that it couldn't necessarily damage Charizard itself, but it also wasn't that threatened by it, especially when protected by Intimidate. Rinya was at a loss, and for a time he dropped the team. Then he came up with what he calls a quote-unquote stupid idea. What if he gave Charizard enough bulk to survive a Max Lightning, and a way to exploit that move against his opponent? Enter Weakness Policy Charizard, the change that shifted the matchup. It's worth mentioning here that Rinya worked with fellow Japanese player Joji Kaeda, aka Suika, to optimize the team. Together, they figured out the spread that made things tick. They invested a ton of HP into his Charizard, dropping its special attack and speed in order to make it work. But if things went well, it would do just as much damage while surviving far more hits. That renewed focus on bulk was applied in more than one place. Zacian likewise got an extra HP injection. Weakness Policy wasn't the only item shifted though. Rinya gave Incineroar the more standard Shuka Berry over his original Figgy Berry, and then applied that concept to Grimmsnarl as well. After the global challenge, Rinya had shifted to Light Clay with both Reflect and Light Screen, as did many other players. However, he faced an issue against opposing Zacian, who would usually one-shot Grimmsnarl after just one attack. So, Rinya found an item that would always improve Grimmsnarl's matchup: Babbery Berry, to reduce super effective steel type damage. Move-wise, he adjusted his Charizard to be Ancient Power over Heat Wave, and switched Groudon to Rock Tomb and Shadow Claw over Stone Edge and Heavy Slam, giving him a little bit more utility outside of Dynamax with Rock Tomb speed drop, as well as a better matchup against Lunala and Calyrex Shadow. The most interesting adjustment though was on his Zacian. Instead of Play Rough, Rinya opted for Quick Attack. The basic theory behind Zacian was simple. You always needed Behemoth Blade for the doubled Dynamax damage. You always needed Protect to keep Zacian safe. You almost certainly wanted Sacred Sword to hit the Steel and Incineroar type Pokemon. And your last move, you could do whatever you wanted. Play Rough was strong in a vacuum and allowed Zacian to hit Palkia and Kyogre for better damage, though that's less important with Gastrodon around. Substitute and Swords Dance were both good utility options to consider. And then there's Quick Attack, which is the option that Rinya actually chose. This move isn't especially strong on its own, but its increased priority can have a huge impact on a battle. It's mostly used to finish off low HP Pokemon like Focus Sash users or Pokemon that just barely survived a big hit. The thing is, thanks to Zacian's ridiculous stats and ability giving it a huge power boost, Quick Attack actually did half decent damage, and could sometimes finish off Pokemon at yellow HP rather than red. On a team without much explicit speed control, an extra form of priority could go a long way. With all these changes made, Rinya finished an incredible 10th place at Worlds, his best ever international performance, done with the team that he created. I can say from experience that almost nothing feels better than proving that your team is the real deal. Here's a fun note from Rinya's team report. He actually thought that Lunala was probably better than Zacian on his team, but he didn't want to switch. Why? I quote, "The pride of using Rinya Sun at all costs." Well, Rinya can be proud. Not only did he create the best team in Sword and Shield, he flipped the concept of Sun teams on their head. Rinya pioneered a Sun team that used offense and defense to get the job done, leveraging Sun's enormous built-in attacking power to invest in defense and open up options that nobody had considered before. In the process, he made his name synonymous with the weather and with the very best in competitive team building. When you think about the greatest teams in all of competitive Pokemon's history, don't just think about the Pokemon, think of Rinya. In his own words, he did it out of pride, a desire to show that the original team concept could still get it done, even after months of work to knock it down. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video and you want to learn more about the history of the best teams in competitive Pokemon, check out this video about the team I used to win the Pokemon World Championships and take down the single strongest Pokemon team in history.